And welcome today to our next class in our series, Race, Whiteness in the Church, called Hospitality, Decentering, and Belonging. And as we have discussed throughout our series, here are some of our objectives: understanding more about the history of race and the experience of being Black in America, to discuss the concept of institutional racism, to understand more about how the sin of racism has impacted the health, unity, and witness of the church, and to explore how we can be a healing community at Grace. And if you saw my email invite to this week, you will know that that's the turn that we're really making right now. This class is kind of introducing the concluding episodes of the series, in which we're really trying to emphasize and encourage all of us to think together about how God may be calling us to change, how God may be calling us to react to some of the things that we've learned this year, and to explore how we can hopefully become that healing presence in the midst of the pain and destruction that race in America has wrought. So without further ado, our first subject in the list today is hospitality. And you might be curious why we're talking about hospitality in a conversation about race. And that may be because your vision of hospitality looks something like this, which is very much what I grew up thinking hospitality was about. It was just, fancy dinner parties, inviting people over to your home that you wanted to impress, or, coworkers or friends or whatever. And that was pretty much the extent to it. I would also add that in my upbringing, hospitality was associated with a very gendered idea, that it was pretty much women's work. And as I feel very called to that myself, that was something I needed to unpack in my own development with time. Here's a book, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in terms of hospitality comes from this source. And it's Christine Pohl, called Making Room, Recovering Hospitality as a Christian Tradition. And this book is not a book about race, but it certainly has consequences for race and some things I think to recommend. And it does come out of the author's context, which you see here in this quote. She says, "At Brick by Brick United Methodist Church in Lexington, Kentucky, we are learning to become one another across racial and socioeconomic differences, with a profound commitment to racial reconciliation as an expression of the power of the gospel. We have pushed past the superficial layers of friendliness to the deeper strata of respect, care, and honesty." So in this book, it's a fascinating study of 2,000 years of Christian history and how the original ethic and witness of hospitality in the church was actually quite radical. And it's really a historical description of how that was lost, how hospitality was watered down, and how it became what you saw in my previous slide, just having dinner parties, often with people who are like you, or some people who you have something to gain from being nice to. And if you think, even in the English language, we have words like hostel and hospital and hotel. All of these words come from hospitality. And actually, what early Christianity did was lay the groundwork for what became all of those institutions. Hospitality included something much bigger than what we today consider hospitality. It included care for the poor. It included giving shelter to travelers. It included welcoming the stranger, welcoming the refugee. so many things that we have created institutions to do in a more in a framework that doesn't allow as much for human connection. And part of the radicalness of early Christian hospitality is it not only provided for human needs, but it provided for spiritual and personal needs by welcoming people into a web of connections, into a healthy functioning community, giving them dignity and recognizing common humanity, while at the same time also providing for physical needs like care for the sick, care for the poor, shelter for the travelers and refugees and things like that. So it's a great book. I recommend reading it. And I want to talk a little bit more then about this practice of hospitality as it was understood by the early church and how that might give us some ethics, some ways forward to think about race as a community here. This icon is a common icon, and it on one hand represents Abraham when he had 3 mysterious guests join him. And I call it proto-hospitality. That's just something I made up because we have the proto-gospel is when in Genesis the serpent's head is crushed, right? And this is sort of the first mention of hospitality in Genesis, in the Bible, when Abraham hosts these guests. And it was deeply woven into the ancient world that created the Bible, that probably the highest ethic was welcome for sojourners and travelers and the vulnerable. This was like the core ethic of the ancient world that, you know, everything else rested upon. And so Abraham would have definitely felt it incumbent upon him to care for these strangers who are wandering through. It was a land that, you know, if you didn't have shelter, it could be deadly. And so he extended welcome to these strangers. There weren't hostels and hotels back in that day. And yet, in this story, he receives a blessing from them. And there's not a sense, even though he's providing them with welcome, there's not a sense of him being the superior one in the relationship. And it's actually understood as some sort of visitation of God. And here in Rublev's Trinity, it's understood as this story of Abraham welcoming, but it's also understood as a representation of the Trinity. In another biblical story we have of hospitality, we have Elijah, who was hosted by the widow of Zarephath. And this is another story that turns our sort of Western modern ideas of hospitality on its head, because who was the benefactor here? So Elijah was the one who was receiving welcome. He needed a place. He was a refugee at this point in time. People were trying to kill him. And the widow received him and gave him a safe place. But he saved her child's life. I mean, he resurrected her child. And, you know, she also benefited greatly in this relationship. This was a mutual relationship. It's not easy to say, oh, she was the host, she was the benefactor, he was receiving. It was a mutual human exchange that benefited them both and created community. It's a generative experience for them both. And of course, Jesus talks about hospitality too, in terms that are radically inclusive. And he says in Luke 14, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, you're supposed to go out and invite all the people in the streets, go out and invite the poor and the lame and the blind and to welcome them into your dinner, instead of doing what we call hospitality so often, which is invite the rich Pharisees and the Sadducees, people who you are trying to impress and who you can benefit from. And this very much informed the early church's ethic of hospitality that was all about transcending status barriers and ethnic barriers and counteracting social stratification in the Roman world by offering modest and equal welcome to everyone. And so when people were welcomed in these early church house church communities, there were poor and rich people blending together in ways that they didn't usually blend in the Roman world. And the communities were constructed in such a way that they were counteracting this notion of, well, the poor people who come are just the benefactees of the wealthy hosts. Rather, they tried to create hospitality that would be a modest and equal welcome to everyone, and actually provide people who didn't have access, who didn't have the social network, all of a sudden access to the network and the social resources of the more wealthy members of the community. So you can understand how something like that could be transformative. And then, of course, there's Jesus. And a Christian understanding of the ethic of hospitality, as Christine Pohl in her book would talk about, is that, you know, we are only open to generosity, all of us, you know, even as we host people in our homes or try to practice hospitality. We can only be open because we have received generosity first from Jesus. We offer welcome to other people only as those who sit at Jesus's table, having been welcomed by him in the midst of our own kinds of poverty and our own failures. And as we as a church open our lives, then we can live in greater dependence on Jesus as our host. So really, this totally dissolves that situation of power difference between a host and the one who is hosted, because Jesus, you know, none of us get to claim being the host, really. Jesus is all of our hosts, welcoming us to his table as we as Christians live as strangers and aliens in this world and struggle to live out an ethic that is different from prevailing cultural norms. Furthermore, into the New Testament, you see this hospitality displayed between Peter and the Gentiles, and this then sets the tone for the early church. You know, it was Jewish people who were the hosts, when it comes down to it, of Christians, of Gentiles into the church, as Dr. Andrew Draper talked about this past fall. And when it came to welcoming the Gentiles, and Peter in particular welcoming Cornelius, who was it that adapted to make space for other people? It was not, you know, it was not the people who were being welcomed, who were receiving welcome, who had to accommodate themselves to the culture of the church. It was the church that accommodated and changed. The Jewish people gave up some of their customs of not going into the household of someone who was a Gentile, of not eating certain foods. They changed their own customs to make space for other people, for the gospel to reach other people. And there was this very powerful ethic then that you see throughout the New Testament, throughout certainly in the writings of Paul, with the church understanding itself as the household of God, which we read divorced somewhat often from its initial context, the way that its hearers would have heard it, because remember, they were doing church in homes. They didn't have fancy church buildings at that point. So this conversation about the church as a household of God was taking place in people's homes while they were having agape meals together and celebrating their community life together in this transformative way. And Christine Pohl writes, God's household represented the welcome of Gentiles into the inheritance together with Israel, and relations within this new household explicitly transcended ethnic boundaries. Worship, care, and hospitality in early Christian households included believers from different political, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And so, within the household, literally within households, the church was breaking down boundaries that existed between people in terms of status and money and what we today call race, but back then they would have understood that as ethnic differences. So I think you can see how recovering a true Christian ethic of hospitality, as it would have been understood by the early church, can definitely be something useful to us as a community at Grace in thinking about our way forward as a community in matters pertaining to race. But another concept I want to talk about today, the second in my list, is decentering. So travel is something that I get to do. Some of you know that I work in the coffee industry professionally. And so prior to the pandemic, I remember a day when I used to get on airplanes and travel a lot. And that is not my reality. That's not a lot of our reality. And so maybe we miss those days. But travel, there's many ways that we think about travel culturally. You might imagine something like this, which is, getting to have a vacation and just lie on the beach at some fancy resort somewhere that's maybe all inclusive and so on. I've done travel like this too, and we all need rest. But there's a different kind of travel, right, too, and there's a different story to travel, which is the exposure to a culture that's different than your own, so that you can become a learner, so that you can place yourself in a different environment and understand, oh, wow, look, like wherever it is that I'm traveling to is different from my home. And isn't that wonderful? And you get to taste different food and learn about the history and the culture of a new place. And that's certainly why a lot of us travel, I think, as well. And in my work, when you do this, you definitely encounter differences of culture. And there's nothing like being outside your own culture, being in the minority, for learning how your culture is a thing, that you're used to doing things in a certain way, and you're not used to doing them in other ways. And I just wanted to point out a few examples from my travel. This was from a trip a couple of years ago to Rwanda. And after visiting a coffee mill, we were invited to a meal together. And when I travel, I've had enough stomach bugs that I'm not a germaphobe generally, before the pandemic anyway. But I travel with this doesn't seem radical now because we're used to COVID times, but lots of hand sanitizer, very careful about all of that because I don't want to get sick from home when I'm, traveling. But here we're served food and it's a common plate, and my hosts are hosting us here, and everyone's eating with their hands out of the same common plate. And that's not the way that I'm used to doing things, but it is the way that I was welcomed into. And so I took part despite some of my fears and concerns, because that is the culture of the place that I was participating in. But it certainly highlighted the ways that my culture was different, and the way that when I receive hospitality in the United States, I expect to have my own place setting, right? Here's another example of culture and the experience of seeing my own culture and seeing other people's culture and understanding and respecting all of those differences. This is my friend Bwimbale John, and he's actually a dear friend. I have such admiration and respect for him. And he is a member of the Bukonzo people, who are one tribe who live in the mountains, the Ruwenzori Mountains of Western Uganda. And their culture is different than my own. And I've gotten beautiful opportunities to learn to get to know John, to learn more about their culture, and even the naming. So Wembale John, in the Bukonzo tribe, the name that comes first is actually a name that you will share with other people, and it's related to whether you are a male or a female and what birth order you are in. So Wembale means second son. So he's the second son, and he's named John. So that's different than naming conventions here in the United States. Their tribe is historically a mountain people, and in their culture, not today, people don't practice this, but John's told me that originally you would be disowned by your family if you left the mountains, because the mountains were seen as this place of refuge and protection. And down in the plains, you have big game, that were dangerous, and you have mosquitoes and disease. So people, the Bukonzo people, stay in the mountains. Polygamy is also something that is practiced among the Bukonzo today. And this is John's brother, one of John's brothers, because his dad has 7 mothers, and he has something like 40 siblings in his family, and he helps to support and care for some of his other siblings in the family. John is my age, and that is a younger brother who I think is like 11 or 12 years old. In saying these things, I also want to be careful not to exoticize my friends. I wanted to talk about this because it helps us to think about culture when we travel, and these are some examples. And culture becomes normal for us when we're living in a dominant culture, so much so that it's hard for us to see it. And then when we travel, we see, oh, people over here live differently than we do in a variety of ways. And so I'm giving examples here. I do want to be very careful not to exoticize my friend's culture. His culture is normal to him. My culture is normal to me. But when we experience other cultures, we get to understand that what we think is normal is not definitively normal for everyone. There is comfort in sameness for every human being. There's comfort in the familiar. And so we can put on our traveler hat and be excited and open to learning about different places and how people live differently when we travel. But then when we come home, we can take off that hat and say, oh, I'm home. I don't have to do that work anymore. Everyone around me should understand the same things and live in the same way. And we can stop doing that work. It can be easy for us to turn this thing off and just expect sameness and to not cultivate the same awareness of others. When you travel, you're very aware because all of a sudden you're in a new environment and you have to be aware. And then you come home and you turn off that awareness. You're not really paying attention. You're just expecting that everyone else is the same as you. And you might turn off that posture of being malleable and being a learner that you often engage with, hopefully, when you travel. And I'm guilty of this too. I come home and I take off my traveler hat and I just expect things to be what I'm used to. But is this the best way for us to live, even when we're at home? Is there a different way? I think that there is a deep goodness, certainly as Christians, but as human beings, to building bridges with other people. And cultural differences, why I'm going here, why I started with travel and some of my experiences of cultural difference there, is that cultural differences are at play in America along lines of race. So when we try to think that everything is the same, we're all here in America, what that is so often is a culture of whiteness, that is expecting everyone else to kind of come to us on our terms, instead of us being open to being a learner, to learning that our culture and what we consider normative is actually a thing. It's something that's, other people live in other ways and have different ways of seeing different cultures that are normative. And this takes some work of translation. I mentioned that idea of being home, and that idea is like, oh, I want to rest. I don't want to have to do work. But as the church, we are actually called on mission. And so the fact that it takes some work maybe to build bridges, to be learners indefinitely, to not close ourselves off, to continue to be aware and to watch and to learn and ask questions, I think that's something that we're called to do. And learning that your way, your culture is a thing, and it's on par with everyone else's culture, but that you don't necessarily need to insist upon your way, or that everyone comes to you on your terms, or that your way is right and normative. Paul, in fact, talks about this in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul didn't stand on his rights. He didn't say, I'm an educated Jewish person and these are my rights as a teacher and all this. But he said, no, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means, I might save some. And he was engaging with real cultural differences, different preferences, different values between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. He says, to the Jewish, I became this. To people who are not under the law, I became this. To the weak, I became this. And what he's talking about is cultural flexibility. He was adapting his means of interacting with people because he had an awareness. He was open to these people and their differences of perspectives and values. And he was saying the gospel is so much more than this, so much more important, that I'm not going to stand on my rights or what I can claim to be normative for myself. I'm going to be culturally flexible. I'm going to become all things to all people so that I can build bridges, so that I might win some. And he even talks later on in this passage about runners, about how people who run like marathons need to train real hard. There has to be strict training, and that you should run as if you win if you're planning on winning the race. So he's not expecting that this doesn't take work. He knows this kind of living does require work. It's not like sitting at home, you just got home from a trip and you collapse on your couch and now I can be comfortable in my sameness. He knows that it takes work, and he's calling the church to do that work. So this word decentering, I wanted to find a good definition when we talk about decentering, and we often hear that coupled with decentering whiteness as a phrase. Here is a definition of decentering itself: displacement from a central position, especially of the individual human subject from a primary place or a central role. But here's another quote. I was trying to find a good definition of decentering whiteness, and I found this in an unusual place. It's a document called Decentering Whiteness and Creating Inclusive and Equitable Conferences. So it's actually about holding conferences and how to make them inclusive. But this was the most concise definition that I found. By decentering whiteness, we mean addressing the norms, practices, content, and ways of being that reflect the values and ideology associated with white culture, which privilege white people and marginalize the cultures, experiences, and perspectives of people of color. So you can see what I'm leading to here. I started off talking about travel and how travel shows you when you're in a different place, in a different environment, how you actually have culture. And your culture is different from someone else's. And that travel forces decentering on you. All of a sudden, you're not in the center, your culture is not in the center. But here at home, where we live, we also need to decenter. And we as a church need to decenter our whiteness that does exactly what this definition here says, that places white culture and white privilege in the center and marginalizes the cultures, experiences, and perspectives of people of color. So this guy looks really mad and angry. I was trying to find pictures that I could illustrate with, and this is maybe a little over the top. I don't want to make it seem like all white people are angry like this, but there is a certain toxic masculinity that goes along with the culture of whiteness often, and we'll talk briefly about that a little bit further on here. I'm getting a little off track, but we need to acknowledge that whiteness is, at least in part, a culture. And it is other things. It's also structural and something that is hardwired into our systems to privilege certain people, but it is a culture. And it is only one culture in the midst of many cultures. I found this article, which I would like to post on the website, the Grace website or something too. I would really recommend reading it, by a woman, a Black woman named Stephanie M. Patterson, and it's in a publication called Presbyterian Women. This article is called Decentering Whiteness in a Multiracial Society. And she says, in this country, whiteness is the standard, the default, from faces celebrated as beautiful to the people serving as leaders, from styles of dress to patterns of speech. Whiteness shapes us as a country and as individuals. And she goes on to say, people of color subconsciously learn in this context when whiteness is centered and we treat it as the only culture that's normative in America. She says, people of color subconsciously learn that whiteness is superior, preferable, the ultimate prize. To achieve happiness, admiration, love, acceptance, visibility, and attain full value in society, assimilation to whiteness is a necessity. Is this how people should have to live? I mean, put yourself, if you haven't experienced this, put yourself in that place and imagine that, to achieve happiness, admiration, and love, you were being asked to assimilate to a culture different than yours. Not everyone in the United States has the same experience of America. And I think that is something that we need to talk about. And I think we are beginning to understand that more, from voting rights to relationships with the police to so many other things. Not everyone has the same experience. And therefore, instead of standing on our own experience and getting angry, we need to cultivate more of a listening and a learning attitude. We need to be willing to entertain other people's viewpoints with curiosity rather than with defensiveness. And there we go. What happened on January 6th? What was that all about, the storming of the Capitol? A lot of coverage has happened on this. We saw crosses, we saw a lot of Christian imagery, and I don't know about you all, but I'm assuming that you all met with that in a lot of the same ways that I did. I was mourning. Sarah and I had a lot of conversations about this. It was painful to see the faith that is so important to me publicly associated and represented in this context. And you see the picture here the person's holding a sign saying Jesus saves, and then people are flooding into the Capitol building and tearing it apart and talking about hanging some of our elected leaders. How is that associated with Christianity? Is that what I believe? Is that a lot of people do actually believe or are afraid that this is inherent to Christianity? But I think a better way of understanding this is that whiteness has infected the church, and even that a lot of people who were in that crowd may not even be as interested in Jesus as they are in the church as a symbol of whiteness, as a symbol of European white culture. And so I think that's something for us to think about. I think that is a huge impact on the church and on the culture. And we, as a church, need to turn our back on whiteness to make it heard that this is not the way of Jesus. The third concept that I wanted to talk about briefly today is belonging. So, hospitality in its true Christian ethic form, it breaks down socioeconomic barriers, barriers of race, and it also breaks down the power relationship of host and person hosted, right? But even moving beyond that, how do we cultivate as a community true belonging so that we're all essentially able to participate in the hosting, all welcomed to together forge a way forward, completely dismissing different lines between who's the host and who is the hosted, and coming to a place where there is deep belonging. I just wanted to briefly mention this. Maybe you've heard of this idea of code switching, maybe you haven't. This is the opposite of belonging. So this is a negative example. This is from an article I found in the Harvard Business Review by an assistant professor at Cornell and others. There was more than one author, Courtney L. McClooney. And she says, code switching involves adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, and expression in a way that will optimize the comfort of others in exchange for fair treatment, which you should have anyway, quality service, and employment opportunities. Research suggests that code switching often occurs in spaces where negative stereotypes of Black people run counter to what are considered appropriate behaviors and norms of a specific environment. This article was written about businesses, not about churches, right? But this happens throughout places where whiteness and white culture are dominant. And in this article, it talks about the constant need to code switch actually has an impact on productivity for employees because it depletes their cognitive resources, it hinders performance, and contributes to burnout because of the amount of energy that it takes to constantly be suppressing your own culture, adopting a different way of speaking, a different appearance, a different way of acting, and needing to hold back some of your true self because there's this feeling that if you're actually just honest and more yourself, you're not going to get the job, or you're not going to get the promotion if you're already hired. And so this question that code switching forces on people of color is, do I suppress my cultural identity for career success or sacrifice career advancement in order to bring my whole self to the workplace? And this shouldn't be the case in business. And it has clear productivity impacts. And it certainly shouldn't be the case in the church where it undoubtedly has negative impacts. In this article, she goes on to say some things that can be done. She recommends evaluating your organization's culture and what are seen as dominant norms there. How are we open to differences? Asking this question. And to focus on not only diversity, which is often talked about, but she makes a distinction between diversity and inclusion. We can hire a few people to show that we're diverse and maybe put their faces on brochures and stuff. But that's not the same as creating an inclusive environment where their ideas and their voices and their whole selves are welcome to the job. And I put these in here because I think these are recommendations for businesses, but these are also things that we can do at Grace. We can evaluate our organization's culture and dominant norms. We can have a conversation about how open we are to differences. And we can focus on creating an environment that is inclusive. This is Dr. Willie Jennings, and he wrote a book. I was actually going to put a picture of it in here, but I forgot to do that. I don't know if you can see my screen. This is the book, After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging. You have probably heard this scholar mentioned 4 or 5 times at least in the course of this course. Jason mentioned him and this book, in fact, in his talk a couple months ago. And he is a professor at Yale Divinity School. And he wrote this book, and it's about theological education, but it's so much more than that. It's really a rich and beautiful work. So even though it's about theological education, I think it has some application for us today. And he talks about how whiteness has impacted theological education and created this culture that centers not only whiteness, but a toxic masculinity and a view of rugged individualism, that in order to be successful, we all have to be, the paradigm for success is a white male who is completely in control of their own destiny, doesn't need anyone else, is dispassionate, and is only about ideas, not about our body, not about our emotions. And it's really interesting, this book, he's speaking from the perspective of a Black man, but there's so much in it that I resonate with. There's a way in which reading the book, you realize that the culture of whiteness has certainly impacted Black people and people of color in much, much harsher, more terrible ways than it has impacted me as a white man. But it has also hurt me. It hurts all of us. This culture is something that we need to unpack because actually it does damage to all of us when it tells us that we can't bring our whole selves to any story and get hired, get that career advancement, be seen as respectable, have our voices listened to. And he talks about this culture where, we of possession, control, and mastery, that we're all supposed to be these rugged individualists that can control and master things and never apologize for our own power, and how throughout academia, but really throughout our whole culture, this creates a wasteland. It creates a wasteland of people who cannot measure up to that churn, right? Cannot keep up with that churn. It creates a path of destruction along the way. And his call is to, in education, but I think this beautifully is a call that we should understand on the church, is a call to gather people together in what he calls border crossing pluralism, to create God-drenched communion and cultivate radical belonging. He calls for the church should be bringing people together who would not normally want to be together. This is what the early church did. and for the church to display the joy and excitement of that communion, causing all of us to see each other in a different light. And elsewhere in this book, he says, and he's talking again about theological education, but I think this again maps onto the church, that the central purpose of theological education, or you can read that as the central purpose of the church, is to give witness to God's embrace of the creature, of us, and to the desire of God to make embrace the vocation of creatures that have yielded to the Spirit. So that all of our work, all of our experience, I shouldn't even say our work, as a church, is to give witness to God's embrace of us, all of us, every tribe and tongue and nation, and to make embrace our vocation, embrace of God's fellow creatures in the world. And he talks about moving towards a place where instead of competition, instead of mastery, instead of the situation where we have to ignore our bodies and our emotions and only bring our professional selves, that we create a world focused on intimacy and communication and reciprocity and mutuality and foster deep connection. So this is belonging. This is what the church should be working to foster. So what can we do here at Grace? And that's what I hope that we will explore with the remaining weeks that we have left in this conversation. But I also see even these remaining weeks as just a beginning. This class is just a beginning. It's to kickstart us into having these conversations and to reimagine what we can be as a community and how we can be there for each other. I don't have any good answers here. I don't have a nice 3-point conclusion here of what we can do. I think it's going to require introspection and prayer and learning and curiosity and work. And it may mean that we become a more diverse community here at Grace, but it may mean that we become better partners and connectors throughout the city with other churches and people throughout the city. But even so, I think we're all going to be benefited here at Grace if we're able to more successfully cultivate a space of deep belonging. And to do that, I think we can explore how we can grow together in empathy, leading with empathy instead of judgment, how we can operate in the world, whether we're travelers or whether we're at home. We can learn to perpetually sit in the place of being a learner, someone who is changeable, someone who's not finished or complete, someone who is a guest, who's willing to receive and listen to other people. We can make space for difference in our community. We can actively engage in loving people across our differences. This could be a radical witness of the church today when we're in such a divisive time. And we can work to create a deep sense of belonging in our community. So that's what I have for you all today. I would love to hear your thoughts. I think I dropped a lot, but I think it's an important discussion to think about hospitality, to think about how we are welcomed by Christ and how we need to offer that welcome to other people, to realize that our culture is a thing. It is not nothing, and it is not the norm for everyone in the world. To see that and to be able to build bridges across that with attitudes of welcoming and intention to create deep belonging. So I'm gonna unshare my screen, and I would love to have some discussion with you all. What do you all think? Comments, questions, thoughts?
There's so much to chew on, but I just want to open by thank you, Drew, for how you've tread these waters and you've invited us to examine and ask hard questions. It's been hard and wonderful.
Thank you, Rebecca. Anyone else? Anything that really stuck out to you that you want to dialogue further about?
I had a question, Drew. Thanks again. Yeah, there's a lot of chew on here. And in some of my discussions, talking about like identity and race and how it's maybe harder for white folks to see their own racial identity, or it's not one of their core identities. I was thinking about the idea of like, as Christians, shouldn't our like Christianity be like our superior identity, and maybe these others don't have to be minimized, but like how do we, like, isn't that what we're rallying around, like an allegiance, sort of like we're all have these mutual allegiance, and I don't know if that's a good way of thinking about it, but it's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. But then one thing you said today kind of rubbed on that, was is turn our backs on whiteness. Could you maybe elaborate on that, what you mean by turn your backs on whiteness? I think I understand like bits of whiteness that are problematic, but that would be helpful for me.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think it's a good way to tackle this question is to think about January 6th and what happened there, which I briefly alluded to. That is a situation where Christianity has been smashed together with nationalism, this whole idea of Christian nationalism, where the church and a vision for white America have become glommed together rather than separated. And I think that's a very impoverished view of things, in part because it creates this triumphalistic attitude that that Christianity is an American thing and is meant to dominate American culture, when in fact there are Christians throughout the world. Christianity is not a white thing. Christianity is not an American thing. America's only been around for some 200 years, right? And the church has been around far longer than that. So Christianity should not be associated inextricably with whiteness, with Americanism. And that's just that's ridiculous from a historical standpoint, right? Because concerns of America have only been around for a relatively short time period in history. But I do think that when we think about Christianity as something that can call us to a higher allegiance, like you said, we need to make sure that that's not just another culture that we're calling Christian, that we're sort of baptizing, and realize that the vision in Revelation that we talked about in the first class is one of Christians from every tribe, culture, and nation coming together and worshiping God in that day in all of our beautiful differences. So it's never a situation of all of us conforming to whiteness, which is really the problem here in America, is not people being white, but it's setting up one culture of whiteness as the thing that everyone has to conform to succeed. So rather, the biblical vision is that there are Christians of every particularity of every culture around the world that will raise their voices in those unique particularities to worship God together. And I think that's what we need to uphold. And our faith then, in its overarchingness, what it does is move us forward, give us an ethic for why we need to work towards that goal and move towards that goal, right? Well, any other last thoughts or questions?
I would just say thank you, Drew. It's fantastic, man. And you know, you and I have been talking in similar categories. We just had a Serving the City meeting yesterday, and some of the same categories come up. I would, I think a big thing for me is the reflection piece, and introspection, you call it, is so important, and is what I'm trying to do with that ministry. And because it reminds me of the fact that doing things with mammon and money and resources does not necessarily mean hospitality and partnership. And I think that's something for us to reflect upon congregation wide, but also with the work we're doing with Serve the City and whatever. Just our congregational posture is, there's a wonderful ways to partner and develop relationships, and mammon is great, it helps, but it's also can keep us from really being changed internally as a community. So anyway, I appreciate what you're bringing today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Well, it's lovely to see all of your faces. And I want to mention our next class, which will be 2 weeks from today. Foxy Davison and her aunt will be coming to speak to us about a couple of organizations that we have, as Grace, helped to partner with, and they're going to share more about those communities and what they have learned from their experience working with those communities. So I hope you all will turn out, and I look forward to seeing you then. Farewell, everyone.